Welcome to the Empowered Parenting for Emotional Wellness podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Day, a mom who believes in the power of education to bring hope and light to our families' lives. Through interviews with mental health experts and advocates, we will learn how to best support emotional resilience in our children, tweens, and teens. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I have a great guest today. Her name is Jennifer Meyer, and she is a therapist here in Loveland, Colorado. So welcome to the podcast, Jen.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm actually a therapist in Fort Collins.
Oh, in Fort Collins. Okay. Sorry.
That's
Close.
okay.
Right down the street.
Right down the street.
Right. Okay. So we are going to talk about abuse today because I know a lot of the clients that you serve are children who have been abused. Is that right?
I actually work a lot more with adults who have endured abuse of some sort, and so I see more of the end product, and I also work with some adolescents who have been abused as well.
Okay, so you're working with a lot of people that are kind of trying to work through what they've been through as children, that still residual effects into their adulthood, would you say?
Yes, and I also work with adults who have been in abusive romantic relationships or partnerships, so just a lot of different exposure to abuse from different sources and different times of their lives.
Okay. Well, okay, so let's start with abuse itself. Can you tell us some statistics on it, and we'll kind of get into what is abuse, and what are the signs of it and all of that.
Right. So the statistics on abuse are very sobering. According to statistics, a child abuse report is made every 10 seconds. The mortality rate with child abuse is very sad and sobering as well. And so the United States, unfortunately, has one of the worst records among industrialized nations. So we lose anywhere from 4 to 7 children a day.
Oh, it's so sad.
In the U.S. as far as deaths.
Due to child abuse.
Due to child abuse.
It's very sad. So isn't it something like 30-something million children in the U.S., do you know? I heard that statistic, but I mean, that is just like mind-blowing, to think how prevalent it is. So
yes.
Why do you think the U.S. sadly is a leader in that realm?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I do a couple things that I'll probably get into here on the abuse topic. Some of the things that do happen, I think we're increasing awareness around abuse. I think we're increasing awareness in terms of what do you do if you come upon child abuse, if you find a mark on a child, if you're working with someone, if you're a mandated reporter. Mandated reporters are usually are trained on how and when to report, but I think most adults are unaware of what you do if you suspect child abuse. And I think the state has worked on making that more visible. I've seen billboards, that say the number to call. That's getting better. So, of course, with increased awareness, there's increased reporting.
Right. So that could be one of the reasons that maybe, we have a higher rate because it's just actually getting addressed, which would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in other countries it's not as much. I was going to ask you, because I was a teacher, and so I was mandated to report, or you would actually lose your teaching license if you knew of an incident. And so who are some of the mandated reporters out there? Teachers are one.
Yep, teachers, counselors, doctors,
probably nurses.
Even nurses, medical staff. A lot of different places, preschools, people that come into contact with children.
Okay. So what are some of the signs that a child is being abused? And then we'll get into what are the forms of abuse after that.
Okay. So signs of a child being abused, a lot of times what we see is more of a physical sign. So you might see a mark on a child, especially if you're working more with younger children. So there could be some sort of a mark, like a bruise. There could be a bite mark. There could be red marks, anything like that. Those are signs of physical abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Signs of other types of abuse, like emotional abuse, verbal abuse, something like neglect. You can see neglect in terms of a child might not be showing up to school like they should. They might be dirty, not wearing appropriate clothing for the weather, all kinds of things like that. So verbal and emotional abuse, what I see, and I have worked more with children in the past, I often see just very meek, just kind of fearful, presentation when it comes to children, and just seeming very, very fearful.
Right. Yeah.
Uncomfortable.
They'd be timid and afraid of things that most kids might not be afraid of.
Yes.
Yes, because that might mean is a sign that they're being intimidated at home. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. So what do you know what proportion? It's kind of hard to separate, when you have sexual, physical, or emotional, because sometimes if you're physically abused, just that is an emotional abuse in itself. And you would think that maybe they would go hand in hand, like maybe they're also being emotionally abused as well, right?
Yes. Yes, that's a fair assumption. Something that I notice when it comes to emotional and verbal abuse is it's a really tough thing to measure. And so when I was looking at statistics of the different types of child abuse, verbal and emotional abuse came up to be a very small percentage. It said 8%. I strongly disagree with that percentage for a couple reasons. Number one, like you just said, for things to escalate to the level of it becoming physical abuse, a lot of times what builds up to that is verbal and emotional abuse.
Right.
So the other thing that I notice is that when it comes to emotional and verbal abuse, a couple things. A lot of times people are not necessarily aware that that's classified as abuse.
Right.
That's one thing. And then what I've noticed as a mandated reporter is that when I have reported pretty strong levels of verbal and emotional abuse, unfortunately, a lot of times that's not followed up on.
Okay, because
So,
it seems like that's so true that it seems like if you have a bruise on your arm, then people will take action because there is proof. But it's harder to quantify what is, does a person just have like a temper problem but just right. We know that really terrible anger can create trauma. I mean,
yes.
if a child's getting yelled at constantly, but then so that's harder to quantify, I think, and to identify. And so I
Yes.
think that's why it's not pursued, do you think?
I think that's part of it. And I think it's hard to know if a parent is just having more of an angry, sort of a mean moment versus this is a pattern of demeaning, putting the child down, taking things out on them, intimidating them in an emotional way,
Right.
Decreasing their self-esteem versus a parent who is normally pretty good and pretty,
Right.
able to contain their anger, has a moment and says something that they regret.
Right. Yeah, that wouldn't be considered abusive. It's not like
Right.
repeated patterns over time, because all of us feel, if you're a really good parent, you might have a moment where you just lose it. And I mean, we're just human beings. But if that's your total pattern and that's how you treat your children over and over and over, it can really be damaging.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So, what do you think the effect? You said kids can become intimidated, and what are some of the long-term? Because you're dealing with adults now, right? So I've known people who have been abused in their childhood, and then in their adulthood, it almost like resurfaces, or it becomes like you're away from it now because that person isn't over you anymore, and that's when you finally have the fallout part. It feels like, where you're starting to process it.
Right. If an adult was a victim of child abuse during their childhood, a lot of times what I see is repeating that pattern in some way. So sometimes people will repeat the pattern in terms of they become abusive toward their own children because that's what they were taught. This
Right.
is how we show love. This is right, love in
Like
quotation
discipline,
marks,
quote unquote.
right?
Yeah.
So there's an increased risk of repeating that pattern on your own children. 30% is about that statistic in terms of repeating the cycle.
Yep.
There's also an increased risk of intimate partner violence, so taking it out on your intimate partner. There's also an increased risk of substance abuse, depression, increased suicide attempts, smoking and drinking at an early age, multiple sexual partners, STDs, unintended pregnancies, so many things.
Wow. So it really has a huge effect on people's lives. And it can be, I mean, just one of those things that you listed could be so devastating for somebody. So if you're dealing with a lot of those things, you know, it's just makes your life a mess, you know, it's kind of hard to deal with.
Absolutely. So in one study said that 80% of 21-year-olds who had experienced child abuse met criteria for at least one psychological disorder. So think about the impact of that.
Right.
And
So would you
lot
say then child abuse causes mental illness or can cause?
it can cause it would create an increased risk of that. And so a lot of times what I see is that people who have been abused as children believe that there's something inherently wrong with them because they were abused. So these two people, parents who are supposed to be the sources of love and full acceptance, are the people who are telling them there's something wrong with them, mistreating them. And so it creates this internal dialogue of there's something flawed with me. And so psychological disorder. And so until that is understood in terms of, wait, there's nothing wrong with me. This is something that happened with my parents.
Right.
This wasn't personal to me. I just need to deal with the effects of this and learn, you know, that it wasn't my fault. That's crucial.
If abuse causes mental illness, is it fair to say that mental illness can also cause abuse?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't say that abuse causes mental illness. I would just say that there's a strong correlation between them. So some people that have been abused do not develop a psychological disorder. So just putting that out there. But yes, a lot of times something that can cause child abuse is the parents who are abusing their children they could have a mental disorder. It could be anything from depression to schizophrenia. You know, that's causing such psychological anguish that it's being taken out on the children. It could also be substance abuse. That's another thing that contributes.
That's a huge one, I would say. So some things are more prevalent. Like I know that schizophrenia is less than 1%, right, of the population, but then depression, like I think 25% of the population has at one point been depressed. And so the sad thing is that almost, I'd say less than half, I guess, are, from my research, are not getting treatment for depression, but it's about 80 to 90% treatable. So that's the sad thing, is if they would get help, they could get better, and then their parenting could be better.
Absolutely. So. Absolutely. And just want to add something about depression. So a lot of times what I hear when I have clients who are adults is if their parents were depressed, what it was more than actual physical child abuse was more neglect. So emotional neglect, where mom or dad would go up and just lock themselves into their rooms for 8 hours a day and not really attend to the children.
So they were depressed themselves, probably, if they're doing that, or maybe mentally ill or abusive.
Right.
Sad. So that's why this cycle goes, right? Keeps going.
And the children spend so much time alone, and boy, I can't even count how many clients I've worked with who have endured some sort of neglect, whether emotional, physical, medical neglect, because mom or dad was very depressed to the point of complete withdrawal.
Oh, it's so sad. So if depression is treatable, it's possible that we can make a difference in the rates of child abuse if people would, you know, realize that depression itself needs to be addressed. That could be a core root of why, you know, there is so much neglect. Sad. Wow, very eye-opening, and it's amazing how it all dovetails, I guess. You know, one thing leads to another, or might be correlated, or so if we can get to the root causes, then, you know, we can address the root issue.
Yes.
And change people's lives, because then they're going to continue So did you say what the percentage was of people? You said, what was the percentage again, Jen, of people who they have been abused and they go on to be abusive to their children?
So about 30% of abused and neglected children will grow up to abuse their own children and continue that cycle.
It's just astonishing. So that's why it just keeps going. I mean, it doesn't get better because it just keeps getting perpetrated, or it perpetuates through the generations, which is very sad.
Right.
I always, how you said, and I've read this too, that people do learn from their parents, like how to parent. And if you're abusive, then they learn abuse. But I didn't know how much of a factor that was. Like, to me, it's like, wouldn't it make sense that if you were abused, you would know not to do that? Do you know what I mean? So I would imagine some people feel that way. Like, wouldn't you know that that was abusive? So why would you do it? So what would you say to that?
Well, so if you're thinking about the statistics, so 30% do go on to abuse, but look at the 70% that say, wait a minute, I was abused. This created so many issues in my life, including a possible psychological disorder. I want to change things for my own children.
Right. So they're
So
trying to break.
70% are breaking that cycle.
Yeah, that's great to look at it that way. That's really positive. And, and then the 30% that haven't, they've either learned it or they've had such trauma or mental illness from the experience that it has affected them to the level that they also are doing it. They, they're
Correct.
just in angst or whatever that
Correct.
affects their children.
Right. And so if we think about those 30%, if they do go on to abuse their own children, my hope as a counselor is that something happens that brings the awareness to someone like, Child Protective Services, where an investigation can be done. And then those parents learn this is qualified as abuse. There's a possible consequence for this. I need to work on this and figure out how to not abuse my children.
Right. It's sad. So if you're working with abused adults that have been abused, then conceivably you are working with people who are abusing their children as well, right? So how do you handle that? What do you do to help them?
So if I do hear of abuse, number one, I have to report it since I'm a mandated reporter.
Right.
Number two, part of what I do with parents that I'm working with is educate them on what is abuse and ways for them to handle themselves, ways to deal with things less reactively, how to take a time out as a parent, how to catch your breath, how to not take it out on other people.
Right.
So a lot of it's education.
So do you think a lot of it, from what you're saying then, some of the coping skills that you're teaching them, do you think it has a lot to do with anger, that they're having anger issues? Does anger play a huge role in abuse?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So yes, anger, I'd say anger and reactivity. A lot of times anger, so if this person that I'm working with as an adult has been abused as a child, a lot of times there's a whole bunch of hurt, and the top part of the emotion that shows is the anger part. It's covering a whole big mountain of hurt. And so the way that comes out is anger, and anger generally is a little more likely to lead to abuse.
Right. And I've always heard anger as a secondary emotion. Something else caused the anger, like you were embarrassed, you were this, you were frustrated, you were that. So there, like you said, if you're hurt, that's one reason you could be angry, is because somebody like totally, missed the boat with you as a child, and you're just angry because your self-worth has been like violated and in many ways.
Correct.
So then that's what would lead them to become angry, and then they lash out at their children. Because it does seem like anger is so damaging. It's horrible.
Well, yeah. Anger in and of itself is a normal thing to experience, and sometimes anger can create good changes in terms of helping us be aware of something has been crossed, we've been mistreated. It's a good awareness tool. It's just, what do we do with that anger?
Right.
How do we deal with that in a constructive way without taking it out on other people?
So that's a good point, because I think you don't want to, like I just made a blanket statement about anger, but it's also a healthy thing because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes your boundaries are being crossed, so you get angry and you
Mm-hmm.
set your boundary and then it's over and then you're done, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so anger does have a place, but it doesn't have a place every day or around the clock. Or, if that's
Mm-hmm.
always how you're being treated is angrily, then after a while, it gives you shell shock. You're just walking
Right.
on eggshells and you're like, oh, you get all anxious. You get a lot of anxiety.
Right. Well, so one of the interesting things too when it comes to anger, so if we're talking about me working with an adult who was abused as a child, one of the healthy things for this person to go through is justified anger in terms
Mm,
of, I was abused as a child. This is unfair.
okay.
And so that anger can create energy, so to
Mm,
speak, to an empowerment in order to deal with those things and try to figure out, why did this happen? What can I do about it? How can I change this for my own children? So that anger can create the energy instead of it being depression where we kind of
right.
withdraw and turn in. Anger
Right.
can create trying to hold people accountable, right?
Yeah.
The people that actually caused this. And then how can I make this different for my own children?
That's actually such a good point because if somebody doesn't ever stand up for themselves, and because they've been so plowed down, right, by someone else who has just like plowed down the boundaries, then they learn to become sort of self-effacing, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
what sometimes you need, like, okay, stand up for yourself, like get angry and fight back. And that part has been missing. So it's almost like compensating for what's been plowed down and lost because you didn't really have that righteous indignation for your own self
Yes.
that you should have
Yes.
had, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you're helping them to kind of like resurrect that and it might come
Mm-hmm.
out really strong at first, but at least it's there. Because
Right.
before it was like almost like a apathetic acceptance or something. And
Mm-hmm.
that never helps you, right? Because you're not like standing up. And if you don't learn
Exactly.
that, you're not going to get better. Is
Right.
that what you'd say? Yeah, I
Yep.
get it. That's such a good point, really. Because, for me, like I have this negative relationship with anger. I'm like, anger, oh, I don't like it, because I don't like it when people get angry with me. I have, been the recipient of anger and I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
But I see that there is a place for it in a healthy way at times,
Right.
not all the time, in how you deal with someone.
Yes, exactly. And I just also want to distinguish between anger of something deep, like having been abused as a child.
Yeah,
And then there's also on the other end of the spectrum is anger that we all experience in day-to-day parenting when it comes
right.
to, sometimes we're just, especially now during COVID, boy, are we
Yes.
being tested as parents. Things are
Yes.
difficult. And so
Oh.
we get overwhelmed, things are
Hmm.
frustrating, children don't do what we want them to do, what we expect them to do, and so there's anger there too.
Right.
So it's just something that happens. It's a normal thing that we experience. It's just, what do you do with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think anger arises in both ends of the spectrum due to a lack of control over the situation? You're just so frustrated with something. So a person who is angry and abusive is somebody who wants to control everything because abuse, at the root of abuse, is trying to control everybody through what you're forcing them to do. But then the other side of, like, when the parent is frustrated and it's normal anger, it's still something that is like, we can't control this pandemic. You can't control that your kids are apathetic and depressed. And it's sad. It's like, we're tired of looking at the same four walls. We can't like control what's in our environment. So it's like this frustration that leads to getting angry. But
Mm-hmm.
it's normal. I mean, why wouldn't you feel that way?
Right.
I mean, I don't think anybody's really thrilled about this situation at all. So we have to give ourselves a little bit of grace, I guess.
So just in terms of, as far as child abuse and people that, parents that are abusing children, there's such a spectrum, there's such a continuum. And so there are people that do get angry and reactive and take this out on children. And it's, like I said earlier, it's a mistake, it's a reactive moment, it's something that they regret. And then they go back and repair that with the children.
Right.
They learn and change it. But there's that all the way to somebody who does want to make the child pay and put them down in such a regular patterned way,
Right.
whether it's through, physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, whatever that is. And
Right.
that's a lot more concerning.
Right. There is one thing that we haven't talked about, and it's that abuse can be also the witnessing of an abuse of a parent.
Yes.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about that? What does that do to a child if they might not be the recipient of it, but they are the witness of it? So
Yes.
and that is considered abusive. So
Right.
what does that do in that situation to the child's, well-being?
Yes. So witnessing intimate partner abuse between parents or between a parent and a parent's significant other can be very damaging to a child as well. And so that's another thing that can be repeated. So if I watch mom or dad get abused by another, by mom or dad's partner, then that increases that child's risk of, continuing that by choosing a partner who is either abusive to them or that this child abuses themselves.
So they're either the abuser or they are the one that allows it to happen to themselves because
Yes.
that's the kind of relationship they've witnessed. So they believe that that's the way that relationships are. And that's what they've learned. So they accept this lack of boundaries and
Yes.
one
And so,
person being in control over the other and being dominant.
right. And it's not necessarily it's not a conscious decision of, okay, this is what love is. This is what I'm out there trying to choose. It's more of children get comfortable, so to speak, in that chaos. And that's what childhood was. And so a lot of times what they go on to choose is something that mimics that childhood chaos. And so it's not a conscious thing of I want to choose somebody who's abusive to me, because I think people who don't really understand abuse don't understand why people would go on and choose someone like this.
That's right. And you know what? The other thing I was looking at was teenage relationships. So you do work with adolescents, right? So
Yes.
I think there's a huge lack of education that needs to be way beefed up with
Yes.
teenagers. I mean, because some of these people go on to marry the person they're with, and you can see, like, as parents, sometimes even you see like clear signs of this dysfunction in these relationships. And a lot of this goes online and all of that. But, the way that they are being treated sometimes is just wrong, or imbalanced. And you can see, like, okay, if they stay with this person, it's going to get worse. So have you seen that with the adolescents you work with? Like
Yes.
So what do you think is the problem? Like, are they not educated enough? Are they coming from that kind of family? What's going on?
So I see a few different things that contribute to that. And I think number one, we definitely do need more awareness and education around what are red flags when it comes to an abusive relationship. I remember being at a school, I think it was in Longmont, probably 5 or 10 years ago, and seeing those little flyers in the girls' restrooms that had little tear-off numbers as far as getting more information on what abuse looks like. But I loved that, and I thought we should have that in all of our schools, not just in the girls' restrooms, but in the boys' restrooms.
Right.
And just education in health class on this is abuse. This is what it looks like to be abusive or controlling in an intimate partner relationship, and this is not okay. This causes damage.
Right.
So I think that's part of it. I think part of it, we need to really focus as parents in being teaching our children about what that looks like, and also being open and non-judgmental so that our children can come and talk to us. Our teens can come and talk to us when they say, does this seem right to you? Is this okay? And we can educate them.
Right, because they're just figuring this out. I mean, when you're young, you don't know, you don't have the wisdom of your parents that have been through all these things. And
Another thing when it comes to intimate partner violence, whether it's a teen or an adult, is a lot of times what precedes the abuse is lots and lots of charm. So it's this sort of, in narcissistic abuse, we use the term love bombing, but it can also be in, let's say a teenager that finds a partner and this person is extremely charming and promising the world and very quick involvement. promising everything. I'm going to be your, your savior, your Prince Charming, all of these wonderful things to you. And then that kind of gets somebody stuck, so to speak. And then the abuse starts happening. The control starts happening in
Gifts,
isolation.
a lot of gifts,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
Gifts, words, promises.
Right. And then they don't let them hang out with their friends anymore. And
Yep.
suddenly things start getting like a little more controlling. And
Yes.
yeah, they get them under their thumb is it grooming? Is that what it's called? Or
You
could
could
that be
call
the
it
word
grooming
for
as
it?
well. Mm-hmm.
It's just, okay. So that's something to look out for, is if someone's just coming on really strong, like maybe
Yes.
that's really going to set up a future for, abusive type of behavior. So that's
Yes.
a good thing to recognize early on, because it's not normal, you know what I mean, in a healthy relationship to be like so, like bringing it on so strong in the beginning. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a little maybe fishy, maybe, because
Right.
something to be aware of.
Yeah. And it feels so good, right? If let's say
Yeah,
that you do come from, let's say that you are struggling at home and you've got this person that says, "Boy, you're my everything. You're everything I've ever wished for." And
right.
all kinds of compliments and lovely things being thrown your way. It feels good. And most of us, we might have a gut instinct that says, "Oh, this feels like a little bit too much or coming on a little strong, but I sure
Right.
like it." So I'm just going
Right.
to push down that gut instinct.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because flattery, right? At first
Mm-hmm.
it's like, oh wow, I'm so special, but
Right.
it's not really genuine per se, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So the alarm bells should go off a little bit in the beginning if somebody's like too effusive.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so what um, how do you help kids deal? Like, what are you doing? Well, you work mostly with the adults, right? So you said you're trying to help them to process maybe what happened and to maybe face the people that might have abused them and just kind of
Mm-hmm.
come to terms with what happened, kind of thing. Is that what you're doing?
Yes. So I do work with some adolescents. And so if there is some level of abuse going on in the adolescent's home, number one, most important is to teach the adolescent that it's not their fault, that it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them because their parents are treating them that way. It means there's something going on with their parent or parents. And so number one, it's not their fault. Number two, this is abuse. This isn't doing something to cause this. This isn't you just imagining this. This actually is child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one, because a lot of times children, adolescents, we internalize and say, this must be my fault.
Right.
So I have to be a better child in order to not get abused.
Right. And then they become like afraid to do anything wrong and
Mm-hmm.
perfectionist, and they're
Absolutely.
maybe more timid because they don't want to incite an explosion, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So that's a big part of it. If there, like I said before, if there is active abuse going on, or if it's something that happened in the past, there are times too for that where I would report that. Sometimes parents are terrified at the prospect of being reported to Child Protective Services. I think a lot of times parents don't understand what's going to happen with CPS with a report.
right.
And a lot of times it's a report, they'll investigate it, or they might not, depending on what gets reported. And really the goal is just to educate them and help them, have the tools that they need in order to not abuse. And sometimes parents have said, wow, I didn't even recognize that that was abusive.
So it's helping them to be educated about their own behavior sometimes. So
Yes.
I think most people think if CPS gets called, my child's taken away, boom. That's what their
Right.
biggest fear is, right? So
Right.
does that happen? What percent of the time? Like, is it not usually, or?
That's a good question. I don't know the statistics on that, but in my, let's see, 7, almost 8 years of practicing, I've never seen that happen. And I've
Oh,
seen some
okay.
pretty rough cases.
Maybe would you say it's more of a wake up call
Can
for
be
the
a great
parents,
wake-up call.
maybe? Yeah.
A great wake-up call. A lot of times when I'm working with so I've worked with a child who was being abused, and I remember telling one of the parents that this does qualify as abuse. I will be making a report, and part of it is also helping the parents be aware of
Right.
okay, this is probably going to be okay. Use this as a wake-up call to do your own therapy, to learn how to deal with your own anger, to deal with your own emotions, your own reactions.
I guess in my, experience, or my perception, I always thought that calling CPS means your child will be taken away, right? So that's just educating the public too about really what that means.
Right.
Because I think, people don't want to report because they don't want that to happen, because
Mm-hmm.
they feel like maybe the child will get taken away and they don't want to be the ones responsible, so they don't say anything. But really what it can do is actually make things better, because then CPS gets involved on behalf of the child,
Mm-hmm.
and, the parent can have a wake up call and, try to work on their behavior to make it better for the child.
Right. And a lot of times, so mandated reporters don't have, we don't have a choice in terms of reporting, but I think sometimes members of the general public, if they witness child abuse, or let's say that one of your kids has a friend over that you believe is being abused, a lot of times we're afraid to report that because we don't want it to come back on us. But you can make a report that's anonymous, because, if you're worried about somebody getting back at you and seeking revenge on you because you made the report, you can do this anonymously.
Oh, that's good to know.
People don't know that, right?
Yeah, that is really good to know, because really the bottom line is the welfare of the kids. I mean,
Yes.
you do not want a child to grow up in this environment. And I mean, 18 years is a long time. That's a long time to go through
Yes.
this, and it could do so much damage for the rest of your life. And you
Yes.
know it well because you're working with these people.
Right.
So, is there maybe a message, like a final message, maybe of like hope? Do you have,
Mm-hmm.
where's the hope in all of this? Because it seems so, I mean, there's so many people that are so affected by it. And I mean, I'm sure you see changes, and in the work that you do, you can see that people's lives can get better. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what would you say maybe as a message of hope about abuse?
I think a big part of it is recognizing that when you do become a parent, it is very difficult. And a lot of times, so the high mortality rate that I gave at the beginning, 70% of those deaths are of children 2 or under. And so those are children that are not able to speak up. They're not going to school to where anyone else would probably see marks on them. That's the unfortunate thing. But what I see is trying to educate parents on, yes, parenthood, especially of very, very young children, is very difficult. It's very challenging. We need support. We need people around us. We need to be able to take a break.
Right.
And so just recognizing that, education on that. What do I do if I feel like I'm going to lose my temper?
Right.
What if my baby won't stop crying? What do I do? So a lot of it's education.
Right.
And being there for other people that are struggling.
Yeah.
Encouraging them to get help.
It's hard. And there's a lot of single parents too. And, they're
Mm-hmm.
doing everything. They're working, and they come home and they take care of their children, and
Mm-hmm.
there's no break for them. And it gets worse and worse psychologically for them. So that makes it really difficult for them to deal with things, everything, something that might be small to someone else who's supported and has a second partner might be really hard for a single parent.
Absolutely.
Tough. So, well, I appreciate the work that you're doing with people, and I know that you're making a difference in this world, and you do it one person at a time, right?
Thank you.
And there's hope and healing. Thank you for what you do. It's really amazing and important, honestly. And there is hope, I think, because you can heal. You can heal.
Yes.
And with education, we can just prevent it.
Yes.
That's the key there, is just getting it not to happen. And then if it does, having the right professionals in place. Because a lot of people think, oh, I'll just tough it out. I'm fine,
Mm-hmm.
or, just get over it. It's no big deal. Or, people minimize like crazy. And it's like, wait a minute, there's some issues here that need to be processed. And so I always think, I encourage people to get professional help no matter what. If you're struggling at all, there's no harm to it at all. It's,
Right.
It can only really help you.
Yes.
So, so thank you for talking to us about all of this. It's kind of a sad and heavy topic, but it does need to be addressed because it is so prevalent, and it is a societal issue. It's just because it doesn't happen in your house doesn't mean it's not happening in the next door. or in your community, and it does affect our communities.
Oh
It
my
affects
gosh.
the health and well-being, right?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you
So,
for having me on.
yeah, thank you for being on. It was such a great learning time. I really appreciate your knowledge, experience, and your heart for what you do too.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Remember, parents, we can empower ourselves through education. I believe that knowledge brings power, hope, and light. Let's do all we can to ensure that our children lead the happy, healthy lives that they deserve. This is my mission, and this is my heart. See you next time. Find out more at www.hopefuldawn.com.